Ethan Cole had spent 4 years learning how to hold a life together with nothing but calloused hands and stubbornness. Single father, 8-year-old son, a debt that did not sleep. He was not supposed to matter to anyone on the 31st floor, but that morning, Vivian Hargrove did not call security. She did not look through him the way executives usually did. She looked straight at him and said, "I need you to pretend to be my husband for 1 year." Ethan went still. Then he asked the only question that made any sense, half serious, half something else entirely. "So, we're sharing a bed?" And that was when everything changed. Ethan is holding that envelope unopened, unsigned. He has a son who deserves better and a debt that never lets him sleep. Does he say yes to a woman who has never needed anyone? Subscribe and hit the bell. His answer will cost them both more than they expect. He did not open the envelope in the elevator. He did not open it in the parking garage below Hargrove Tower or in his truck on the way out of the lot while the rain moved across the windshield in slow diagonals. He drove home through wet Seattle's streets with the envelope sitting on the passenger seat like a passenger who had not been invited, and he did not look at it once. He had learned a long time ago that some things got larger the longer you stared at them, and he was not ready for this one to get any larger than it already was. Noah was asleep when Ethan got home. The boy was curled on the old corduroy sofa with a library book still open across his chest, the reading lamp still on. His socks mismatched the way they always were at the end of a long week. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment and just watched him breathe. The rise and fall of it. The particular piece of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of the night. Then he turned off the lamp, lifted the book carefully, and set it on the coffee table. He pulled the blanket from the arm of the sofa and covered his son and stood there for a few more seconds in the dark before he went to the kitchen. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. 14 pages, typed clean, formatted with the precision of a document produced by people who are paid to leave nothing to interpretation. Every clause was defined. Every scenario was accounted for. There was a section about cohabitation, 2 separate rooms, clearly delineated. A section about public appearances, listing the categories of events that would require joint attendance and the minimum notice required for each. A section about financial transfers, detailing the schedule and method of payment. A section about termination, which could be triggered by either party under a specific list of conditions, none of which had anything to do with what either of them might feel. The contract had been written with the deliberate exclusion of the word feelings, and that absence was itself a kind of language. He owed $89,000 in medical debt. The number had lived in the back of his mind for 4 years, the way certain sounds do after a trauma, not always at the front of your awareness, but never entirely absent either. It had been accumulating since the last months of Dana's illness, when the treatment stopped working but the bills did not stop coming, and the hospital kept generating charges with the indifferent regularity of a machine that does not know when to stop. He had been paying it down in small amounts, the way you try to address something overwhelming by breaking it into pieces small enough to carry. But the total moved slowly, and the interest did not. Noah's school had sent home a letter about the following year's tuition increase. There was a private school across town with a science program that Noah would have thrived in, small classes, dedicated teachers, the kind of environment where a curious 8-year-old boy, who argued quietly with math worksheets, could turn into something extraordinary. Ethan had picked up the scholarship application twice. Both times he had put it back in the drawer. He sat at the kitchen table and thought about Dana. 4 years ago, she had lain in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and the particular staleness of recycled air, and she had looked at him with the clarity that comes to people who know they are close to the end and have decided to use what time is left for the things that matter most. She had said, without hesitation and without looking away, "Don't let Noah grow up afraid." She had not said afraid of what. She had not needed to. She had meant afraid of the world, afraid of hunger, afraid of the particular helplessness that accumulates in a child who watches doors close, because no one in his life can afford the key. Ethan looked at the contract for a long time. He thought about what it would mean to say yes and what it would mean to say no. He thought about the kind of father he was trying to be and whether the two things were the same man or different men wearing the same face. Eventually, he folded the contract, slid it back into the envelope, and went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, he drove to Hargrove Tower, rode the elevator to the 31st floor, and walked past the assistant without slowing down. The assistant started to rise. Ethan said he would only need a minute. He crossed the office to Vivian's desk and placed the envelope in front of her. He told her he had 2 conditions that were not negotiable and were not going to be subject to revision. First, Noah would not appear at any public event, any family occasion, any photo shoot, or any situation where his presence could be used to make the arrangement appear more genuine. His son's life was not part of the performance. Second, if anything touched Noah, his school, his reputation, his sense of safety, his name in any context it did not belong in the contract ended immediately. Not in 30 days. Not after a lawyer's letter. That same day, without discussion, without a conversation, without anything except Ethan walking out the door. Vivian looked at him across the desk. She had a particular kind of stillness that had taken, Ethan suspected, a long time to develop the stillness of someone who has learned to hold everything internal where it cannot be read. She did not argue. She did not negotiate. She reached for a pen, added his conditions to the contract in her own handwriting, initialed both additions, and slid the document back across the desk. He signed his name, she signed hers. She extended her hand, and he shook it, and the handshake was exactly what it looked like, the sealing of an agreement between 2 people who understood precisely what they were doing and were under no illusions about what it was. He moved in on a Thursday evening. The penthouse was the kind of space that expensive architects design for people who want to be impressed when they walk in, rather than comfortable once they're there. Everything was precise and cold and impeccably maintained. The kitchen had appliances that looked as though they had been installed for appearance rather than use. The living room had a view of Elliott Bay that was genuinely stunning, and the stunning quality of it somehow made the room feel more empty rather than less. He understood immediately why Noah had said it looked like a hotel. Vivian showed him the guest room at the far end of the hall, separated from her room by a long corridor and a study. She went over the rules again, briefly and without ceremony. His schedule, her schedule, the expectation that neither of them would make demands on the other's time beyond what the contract required. He set his bag on the floor of the room and looked around. The closet was larger than the bathroom in his old apartment. He felt, with considerable clarity, like an intruder. Noah came the following weekend. There was not yet a reliable alternative, so Ethan picked him up from the after-school program on Friday and drove him across town, and Noah sat in the back seat and was quiet in the way he got when something was forming in his mind that had not yet become words. They rode the elevator to the 31st floor. Noah stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the numbers rise. When the doors opened and they stepped into the penthouse and Noah looked around at the clean lines, the pale upholstery, the surfaces unmarked by any evidence of a life actually lived on them, he was silent for a moment that felt significant. Then he said, "Dad, does anyone actually live here? It looks like a hotel." Vivian was standing near the kitchen with a glass of water. She heard it. Ethan saw the flicker of something cross her face, not offense, but something more uncomfortable than that. She looked around her own apartment, the way you sometimes see yourself in a photograph taken by someone else, from an angle you had not known existed, showing you something true that you had not noticed because you had been looking from the inside. That afternoon, Ethan made pasta and a simple salad and picked up bread from the bakery near his old apartment because Noah liked that bread specifically, and it had been a week since they'd had it. Noah stood at the counter and peeled garlic cloves and talked without stopping about a project on the water cycle, and a boy in his class named Marcus, who had apparently done the entire thing incorrectly on purpose just to observe the outcome. Ethan listened and cooked and let the kitchen become what kitchens become when someone who knows how to use one actually does. Warm, imprecise, full of ordinary life. Vivian stood in the doorway for several minutes. She was holding her laptop. She was not using it. Noah looked up and saw her standing there and said, with the directness that children deploy without any awareness of its weight, "Aren't you eating with us?" Vivian set the laptop on the counter. She pulled out a chair at the table. She sat down. It was the first meal she had eaten in that apartment with another person in 3 years, and nothing about it was planned. And it was the most real evening she had spent in that space since she had moved in. After dinner, while Ethan was helping Noah rinse the dishes, he noticed the photograph on the bookshelf. It was face down, the way you leave something you cannot throw away but cannot bear to look at. He picked it up and turned it over. A girl of about 10, standing beside a large man in a construction worker's jacket. Both of them laughing at something outside the frame. A construction site visible behind them, scaffolding climbing a gray sky. The man was black. Ethan looked at the photograph for a moment. He set it back on the shelf, face up this time, so the image faced the room. Then he went back to the kitchen. 3 weeks after he moved in, Vivian told him about the family dinner. It would be held at Richard Hargrove's home, a 12-room colonial in a suburb south of the city, the kind of house that had been in the family long enough to stop being a purchase and start being a statement. Richard met them at the door. He was 68 years old and had the build of a man who had once played competitive sports and carried a specific resentment of the decades that had changed that. He shook Ethan's hand with the calibrated pressure of someone who uses handshakes to communicate things he would never say directly. The grip was firm enough to register and not firm enough to be called aggressive. He smiled in the way that people smile when they have already formed a judgment and are waiting to see whether it holds. He said he had not known Vivian was seeing anyone. Vivian said they had kept it private. He asked how they had met. Ethan said through work. Richard raised his eyebrows with the careful minimalism of someone who wants you to read something in the expression without being able to accuse him of having shown it. He asked what Ethan did. Ethan told him plumbing, maintenance contracts, the trades. He was the contractor who held the service agreement for Hargrove Tower. Richard said, "Interesting. Vivian has always had unexpected choices." The word unexpected was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and everyone at the table understood exactly what kind of work it was doing. The dinner went on for 2 hours. The food was technically accomplished and formally presented and did not taste like anything in particular because it had not been cooked with any particular feeling. Ethan sat beside Vivian and answered questions when they were addressed to him, and observed the rest with the quiet attention he had always brought to unfamiliar environments. There were 2 other guests, a cousin named Patricia, who seemed genuinely warm and slightly relieved to have someone new to talk to, and a man named Gerald, who worked for Richard in some capacity that was never clearly stated, and who watched Ethan throughout the meal with the particular steadiness of someone running a slow calculation. At dessert, when the other conversations had occupied Patricia and Gerald, Richard leaned slightly in Ethan's direction and said in a quiet voice that was pitched for Ethan alone, "I just want to make sure you understand the world you're stepping into. Not everyone is suited to an environment like this." He had said it pleasantly. He had constructed the sentence so that any objection to it would sound unreasonable, because the words themselves were technically neutral and only the delivery carried the actual content. It was a practice technique, the kind that requires years to perfect. Ethan put down his dessert spoon. He looked at Richard Hargrove steadily and without heat and said, "I'm used to working in environments other people don't want to go into, Mr. Hargrove. That's what the trades are." The table was quiet for a moment. Under the table, Vivian's hand, which had been held tightly in her lap throughout the entire meal, slowly opened. A local news blog ran the photograph 4 days after the dinner. Someone had taken it from the street as Ethan and Vivian walked to the car caught in the amber light of the driveway lanterns. Her hand on his arm, both of them moving through the frame at the angle of people who have been talking and are still mid-sentence. The caption was the careful sort of ambiguous that implies something while avoiding accountability for the implication, something about the CEO of Hargrove Realty and her companion for the evening, followed by a question mark. The comments split in a way Ethan had expected, half curious, half something that dressed itself as concern but carried a different smell underneath. Meg called Vivian at 7 in the morning. Vivian already had the article open on her phone. She was standing at the kitchen counter with her coffee and the particular stillness she used when she was calculating her next move. She said she was considering a statement. Ethan, who had come out for water, looked across the kitchen and shook his head. He said, "The moment you explain yourself, you've already conceded the ground." Vivian set her phone down face first. She did not make a statement. That afternoon, the school called nothing serious, just a mention that some of Noah's classmates had been asking him questions, the way children do when something filters down from the adult world through the sideways channels of rumor and cafeteria noise. Noah had apparently handled it with the directness that characterized most of his interactions with the world. He had told the boy who asked that yes, his dad knew someone who had been in the news, and no, it wasn't a significant event, and could they please return to the subject of the water cycle project. Ethan picked Noah up that evening and drove him home and made grilled cheese and tomato soup, and he did not raise the school call until Noah was comfortable and 2/3 through his dinner. Noah shrugged and said it was fine. Ethan said okay and watched his son for the rest of the evening with the vigilance of a parent who has learned that the things children describe as fine are sometimes precisely the things that are not. That night, after Noah was asleep, Ethan went out to the small balcony off the living room. The air was cool and salt-edged, carrying the particular smell of the sound at night. Vivian was already there, leaning with her forearms on the railing, looking out at the lights reflected in the dark water. They stood without speaking for a while. Then she began to tell him about the photograph. His name had been Walter. He had been the head foreman on her father's construction crews for 23 years. A large, quiet man with capable hands and an unhurried way of explaining things. When Vivian was young, her father had sometimes brought her to job sites on weekend mornings while he reviewed progress reports and held brief meetings with the project managers. Her father had important things to attend to. Walter had walked with her instead. He had shown her how to read a blueprint, how to identify a properly laid foundation, how to understand the difference between what something looked like and whether it would hold. He had answered every question she asked, and she had asked a great many, without ever making her feel that any of them were not worth answering. He had died of a stroke when she was 15. She had turned the photograph over because every time she looked at it she missed him, and she did not like to miss things in front of other people. Ethan said, "I turned it face up." She said, "I know." She did not turn it over again. The annual Hargrove Realty Gala was held at a hotel downtown on a Thursday in the third month. 500 guests, a ballroom that cost more per hour than most people's rent, the kind of event where the purpose is simultaneously to celebrate the company's success and to remind everyone in the room of the hierarchy within which that success exists. Ethan wore a suit he had purchased specifically for the occasion, and wore it with the ease of a man who is not troubled by the question of whether he belongs somewhere, because he has long since stopped asking it. They moved through the room together. Vivian introduced him to board members, to investment partners, to the senior staff whose photographs lined the hallway outside her office. He shook hands, listened carefully, spoke when he had something to contribute, and held his own, not by performing competence but by actually having it, which turned out to be easier and more convincing than any performance could have been. A board member named Caldwell, silver-haired, pleased with himself in the particular way of men who have been listened to for so long they have forgotten. "It is not their natural right?" asked Ethan. At one point about his professional background in the real estate sector, the question was politely constructed but aimed at something specific, the way a test is aimed when the person giving it already knows what they're hoping to find. Ethan said he did not have a background in real estate. He said he had spent 20 years in the trades and he knew what a sound building looked like from the foundation up, and that knowledge had been built in crawl spaces and utility rooms and mechanical floors, not in conference rooms. He said he did not consider that a disadvantage. Vivian laughed. It was brief and quiet and absolutely real, and it was audible to the three people standing nearest to them, and Caldwell registered it with the expression of a man who has just learned something he had not expected to learn. They left a little after 11. The hotel elevator was old and made its displeasure at being used known through a series of mechanical hesitations before it moved at all. When it stopped between floors, an abrupt, gentle jolt, the kind that lifts your stomach slightly before the stillness registers, they both felt it at the same time. The display showed they were between the 7th and 8th floors. The emergency phone informed them, in the flat tone of recorded messages, that service would resume within approximately 4 minutes. They stood on opposite sides of the small car. Vivian had her head back against the wall, her eyes closed. The tension of the evening was still in her jaw and shoulders. Ethan stood across from her with his hands in his coat pockets and gave her the silence. Then he asked if she was okay. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Her expression was not guarded in the way it usually was, not open exactly, but the control was thinner than usual, worn down by the hours of performance. She said, "I genuinely cannot remember the last time someone asked me that and actually meant it." The elevator moved. They rode up in silence and went to their separate rooms, and Ethan lay in the dark for a long time, unable to locate any other thought. At breakfast the next morning, Noah was working his way through a bowl of cereal and an argument with a math worksheet when he looked up at Vivian, who was standing at the counter with her coffee, and said with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who has not yet learned to edit himself, "Do you ever get sad?" Vivian put her cup down. She said, "Yes." Noah processed this with the seriousness he brought to most information. He nodded and said, "My dad gets sad too, but he doesn't really say it out loud." Vivian looked across the kitchen at Ethan. Ethan kept his eyes on his toast. Richard found Ethan alone in the parking garage of Hargrove Tower on a Wednesday afternoon in the 5th month. There was a section of the structure where the camera angles did not quite converge, a gap between two concrete pillars that left a narrow blind spot, and Richard had clearly identified it in advance because that was precisely where he was standing when Ethan came around the corner to his truck. He walked over with the unhurried ease of a man who has decided the outcome of a conversation before it begins. He said he bore Ethan no personal animosity. He wanted to be clear about that. He simply believed that Ethan had not been given the full picture of the situation he was involved in. And Richard felt a responsibility to Ethan, he said, as much as to the family to correct that. He said Vivian was going to lose the board vote when it came. He said his legal team had been compiling evidence for months, and the picture they were assembling was one that Vivian could not explain away. He said when the arrangement became public again, when, not if, Ethan would be named in every account of it, and that exposure would follow him in ways that had nothing to do with any good intentions he might have had going in. He placed a sealed envelope on the hood of Ethan's truck. He said there was enough inside to replace everything Vivian was paying Ethan and double it. All that was required in return was absence. No confrontation, no drama, no formal exit. Ethan simply stopped coming. Richard would handle everything else. Ethan looked at the envelope. Then he looked at Richard. He said, Richard said he did. Ethan said, "Then you know I'm used to handling the things other people call someone else for." He picked up the envelope and placed it back in Richard's hands with a deliberateness that was not unkind, but left no room for alternative interpretation. Then he unlocked his truck. What Richard could not have seen, because Ethan had not made any visible gesture toward his phone, was that the recording app had been running since the moment Richard's footsteps had first sounded in that particular section of the garage. It was not a calculated move so much as an instinct, the kind that forms in a person who has spent enough years in unfamiliar places to recognize, before he can name it, when the air in a room has changed. He drove to the 31st floor and told Vivian everything. He sat across from her in her office and played the audio and watched her face while she listened. She sat with her arms folded across her chest, her eyes on a point in the middle distance, her expression controlled into the professional blankness she wore when something was requiring more energy to manage than she wanted to show. When it ended, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked him why he hadn't taken it. He said, "Because I'm not that kind of person." She looked at him, not at the contract, not at the performance, not at the arrangement that had brought him into her life and established the terms of his presence in it. She looked at the man sitting across from her in his work jacket with his truck keys still in his hand, and something in her expression changed in a way that did not have a name she was ready to reach for yet. The email from Richard's attorney arrived on a Tuesday night, and Meg called Vivian at 11:17. Vivian read it while Meg was still on the phone and said very little in response. She thanked Meg and said she would call in the morning. She hung up and stood at the window and looked at the city below her, at the rain-reflected lights spread out across the dark, and she stood there for a long time without moving and without making any sound. Ethan saw the kitchen light on when he passed the hallway at 2 in the morning. He had not been sleeping, his mind had been running the same loop since he had heard Vivian's voice on the phone earlier, the particular flatness in it that he recognized as the sound of someone working very hard to hold a great deal together. He pushed the kitchen door open. She was on the floor. Her back was against the refrigerator and both hands were wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold some time ago. She was not reading, not looking at her phone, not doing any of the productive things she reached for when the world felt like too much. She was just sitting on the tile floor of her own kitchen in the middle of the night, and she looked up when he came in, and she did not try to stand up or compose herself or redirect the conversation. Ethan sat down on the floor beside her, his back against the same refrigerator, the cold of the tile coming up through his clothes. They sat in silence for a while. Then Vivian said, quietly, in the voice of someone who is saying something they have been carrying for a long time, "I have run this company for 5 years. I increased revenue by 41%. I restructured the debt my father left. I opened 3 markets that were not there before I started. And the only thing anyone in that building is still asking about is whether or not I have a husband." The sentence sat between them in the dark. Ethan did not try to fix it or redirect it or respond to it with the kind of optimism that would have missed the point entirely. He said, "Tomorrow I'll be there. You're not walking into that room alone." Vivian turned her head and looked at him. For 8 months, she had managed everything, every expression, every moment of visibility, every degree of distance between what she felt and what she allowed to appear on the surface. She did not cry, but she also did not perform being fine, and that was something she had not allowed herself in front of another person in longer than she could accurately recall. The not pretending felt, in the quiet of that kitchen at 2 in the morning, like something she had not known she had been waiting to put down. The board meeting was held at 10 on a Thursday morning, 40th floor, a room of glass walls and serious furniture, and the kind of air conditioning that keeps corporate spaces at a temperature that suggests the room itself is trying to discourage any emotion that is not efficiency. 9 people were seated at the table when Ethan and Vivian arrived. Richard sat at the far end, flanked by his legal team, wearing the composed expression of a man who has convinced himself the outcome is already settled. The board chair was a woman named Patricia Lund. She opened the session crisply and without ceremony, acknowledged the circumstances that had prompted the meeting, and invited Richard to proceed. Richard stood. He said that his concern for his niece was deep and genuine, and it was precisely that concern that had led him here. He said that certain information had come to light that the board had a responsibility to examine. He laid it out in sequence. The contract, the financial transfers, the timeline showing Ethan moving into the apartment within days of the agreement being signed. He said the word fraud twice. He said integrity once. He spoke about the will and the clause and what it required, and what Vivian's actions said about her fitness to interpret the responsibilities of leadership. The room was very quiet when he finished. Every person at the table looked at Vivian. She sat still for a moment, then she stood. She said Richard was correct. She had entered into a contract with Ethan Cole. She had transferred money to his accounts. She had asked him to present as her husband for the duration of the agreement. All of it was true, and she was not going to stand in front of this board and deny any part of it. She said the question the board needed to examine was not whether she had done those things. The question was, why a woman who had rebuilt this company's financial standing, opened 3 new markets, and managed the most complex restructuring in Hargrove Realty's history, still had to do something like this to hold the position she had spent her career earning. She said her father's will had been written with a clause that treated marriage as a professional prerequisite. She said she had done what she needed to do to work within a rule she had not made and did not agree with, and she was not going to apologize for it. Then Ethan stood up. Patricia Lund looked at him with the even expression of someone who has learned to wait before deciding what to make of the unexpected. He said he had something the board needed to hear. He placed his phone on the table and played the recording from the parking garage. Richard's voice filled the boardroom, unhurried, confident, specific about the amount, specific about the instruction, clear about the terms. When it ended, the silence was different from the silence before Vivian had spoken. It had a different texture. Ethan put a folder on the table in front of Patricia Lund. He said that while preparing for this meeting, he had been given access to Vivian's internal files. Inside those files, he had found something. Richard Hargrove had used his executive system credentials to access Vivian's private email correspondence for 14 months. He had read her calendar entries, he had accessed negotiation records from 2 active deals, and taken actions that delayed both of them at critical junctures. The folder contained the printed logs, access records, timestamps, account identifiers that mapped the access back to Richard's credentials over a span of more than a year. He said, "Mr. Hargrove came in here today to talk about fraud. I think the board should make sure it's working with a complete definition of that word." Patricia Lund opened the folder. She read. The boardroom stayed quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something has shifted in a way that cannot be shifted back. She looked up at Richard. She asked whether the access logs were accurate. Richard said that his access had been part of his oversight responsibilities as a senior family stakeholder. Patricia said it looked like something else. Another board member said it looked like it met the definition of grounds for immediate suspension. They deliberated for 40 minutes while Ethan and Vivian waited in the hallway. Richard stood at the far end of the corridor near the emergency stairwell and did not look in their direction. The building sounds moved around them, the low hum of the elevator shaft, the distant phone ringing somewhere below, the quiet that accumulates in hallways where important things are being decided. Vivian asked quietly, not looking at him, "Do you think I lose?" Ethan said, "I think whatever they decide in that room, you just stood up in front of all of them and told the truth. That's not nothing." The door opened. Patricia Lund stepped into the hallway. She said the board had reached its determination. Richard Hargrove would be suspended from his seat, pending a full internal investigation into the unauthorized access. Vivian would retain her position as CEO by a margin of 5 votes to 2. The marriage clause in the estate documents would be referred to outside legal counsel for a review of its validity and enforceability. The contractual arrangement between Vivian and Ethan was to be formally dissolved within 30 days. She paused. She looked at Ethan. She said, "She's fortunate to have had someone willing to stand in that room with her the way you did today." Then she went back inside and closed the door. They walked to the parking garage in silence, their footsteps steady in the stairwell. At Vivian's car, she stopped and turned to face him. The underground light was the particular yellow-gray of parking structures, and she looked tired in a way she had been too disciplined to let show before today. She said the contract was dissolved. He didn't owe her anything further. He said he knew. She said, "Are you going to leave?" He stood with his keys in his hand and considered the question honestly. He said he needed some time to figure out what his life looked like now that a document wasn't drawing its lines. She said she understood. She got in her car and drove out of the garage. He stood there in the quiet for a while, listening to the sound of the engine fade, and tried to identify what it was that was sitting in his chest. It didn't feel like victory. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like the end of something he had not known he was attached to until it was over. He moved out 2 weeks later. Vivian was not there. She had texted the evening before, brief, minimal, the kind of message composed by someone who is working hard to keep too much from showing through the language. She said she had somewhere to be. She said she hoped he found what he was looking for. Noah came to help carry boxes. He worked with the focused seriousness of a child who has decided to treat a difficult thing as a practical problem. He carried a box of books and a bag of kitchen things and did not ask questions until they were at the door, ready to leave, and he turned and looked back at the apartment. He said, "Dad, are you sad?" Ethan said a little. Noah said, "Is Miss Vivian sad?" Ethan said he thought she probably was. Noah thought about this with the thoroughness he brought to most things. He said, "Then, why are we leaving?" Ethan had no answer that was equal to the question. He held the door and they went to the elevator and rode down in the yellow light, the box of books between them, and he drove his son home through the familiar streets of his actual life and made dinner and read a chapter of the book they were working through together and put his boy to bed and sat alone in the kitchen for a long time afterward. 3 days later, his phone buzzed. The message was from Vivian. She said she did not know how to do what she was trying to do. She said she had spent so much of her life performing versions of herself for different rooms: the decisive CEO, the composed Hargrove daughter, the controlled professional who did not require anything from anyone, that she had nearly forgotten there was a version underneath all of it that was simply herself, without calculation, without strategy. She said she wanted to find out whether that version of herself, and whatever was real about the last several months, could amount to something. She said she did not know if it would work. She said she wanted to try if he was willing. Ethan read the message once. He looked at Noah eating breakfast, arguing quietly with his cereal for reasons that were not immediately clear. He typed back, "Where? What time?" They met at a small coffee shop near the waterfront, the kind of place that has occupied the same corner for 2 decades and carries the accumulated warmth of that history in every surface. Mismatched chairs, a handwritten menu board, music playing at the volume of an afterthought. Vivian was already there when Ethan arrived, sitting by the window with a cup of tea in front of her. She was wearing a plain jacket and jeans, her hair pulled back without ceremony. No Meg, no phone visible on the table, no agenda. She looked, for the first time in all the months he had known her, like someone who had put everything down and was sitting with her hands open. She looked nervous. He had genuinely never seen her look nervous before. He sat down across from her and said hello. She said hello back. They were quiet for a moment, not the strained quiet of 2 people managing a situation, but the quiet of 2 people standing on the other side of something and taking a moment to actually look at where they are. Then Vivian said, "So, where do we start?" Ethan said, "From the beginning. No contract this time." She held his eyes for a moment. Then, for the first time in the entire span of everything that had passed between them, the handshake and the contract and the family dinners and the gala and the boardroom and the kitchen floor at 2 in the morning, Vivian Hargrove smiled first. They sat there as the morning moved around them and talked about ordinary things. Noah's ongoing dispute with mathematics, a building she had driven past on the way here that caught her eye, a book Ethan had been slowly working through for 3 months without quite finishing it. No roles to maintain, no performance running in the background. Just 2 people in an ordinary place on an ordinary morning, finding out what came next. Neither of them was pretending, and that turned out to be a very good place to start.